Hi, this is Jim Rice, and welcome to this segment of the Supply Chain Finance module. We're focused on supply chain finance basics. This segment, we're going to be focused specifically on explaining how supply chain finance works. And I'll use one example to illustrate. It'll be one of the most common methods. It's called factoring, and there are a couple of variations there, but we'll talk right about that. Now, there are two options for financing. Generally speaking, not just about supply chains, but generally speaking, two options for financing: debt and you can use debt or equity. Debt is basically a loan. Equity is basically when you sell part of whatever you have to raise cash. And when we apply these options to the supply chain, most of the time the firms are using debt or loans to provide that liquidity or the cash to the firm. Sometimes it does entail the sale of an asset, and the asset in most cases is going to be a receivable from the buyer. That is an obligation to pay from the buyer, and usually that occurs at a deep discount. In this case, the example I'm going to go over today is going to be factoring, and that's where they are selling the receivable. Again, there are many variations, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. Let's just go over basically how supply chain works. Take the case of a raw material purchase, and it all starts when the customer places an order on the supplier, and the supplier then goes through the process of buying their raw materials, producing the product, and then ultimately they deliver at time t=0. Well, at time t=0, two things occur. The customer, a clock starts, if you will, on the obligation for the customer to pay the supplier, and the supplier actually gets an obligation to pay a certain amount. In this case, we have identified that as an amount Y at a certain time, and that time is at t=x. We haven't defined that particular time. And so that's the basic way it works for a purchase and sale. Now, a seller, if they don't want to wait these X days, they can consider other options. And let's talk about one particular option called factoring. Now, again, if the seller does not want to wait, the seller can include and involve a third party. And that, in this particular case, I've suggested that it's a collections agency. Whatever that particular third party is, they're called the factor. Right? And so the factor is going to purchase the obligation to pay from the buyer. They're going to purchase that from the supplier. And so this collections agency, the factor, is going to get this obligation to pay Y at time X. All right? And they're going to collect that from the customer. So in exchange for that, though, the collections agency gives cash, money, and a certain amount to the supplier. And in that particular case, it's going to be whatever that amount is, less some percentage. We don't know what that percentage is. It varies based on a number of different factors. All right? So that's basically how factoring works. But there are a couple of different options. Factoring has two specific options. One is where you have factoring with recourse and factoring without recourse. It's very simple. In the case of factoring with recourse, the factor can go back to the seller to collect if the buyer fails to pay. And factoring without recourse is the case where the factor has no option to go back to the seller to collect. They can only collect from the buyer. Let's look at how that works out using this example as I've portrayed before. We have a third party, the factor, in this case a collections agency. They've made arrangements to buy that obligation to pay Y at time X from the supplier, and their intention is to collect from the customer. But the customer fails to pay. Right, in this case, when they have factoring with recourse, they go back to the seller, and the seller has an obligation to pay the factor, and they repay that factor. Of course, the terms, how much, the timing, that's subject to the agreement that is created between the seller and the agency and the factor. Now, factoring without recourse is the same process as we've outlined before. The factor buys that obligation to pay, but when they go to collect and the customer fails to pay, they don't have any other options. So, broadly speaking, there are many options to finance receivables. Factoring is a common approach. And some of the other options or a function of a couple of different factors, whether you want to borrow against it or you want to sell that receivable. The timing of the payments is an important factor. Who bears the risk is very important, because that also determines the rate that someone might appreciate or enjoy, and the use of different kinds of collateral, and also who initiates the arrangement. So each of these have different impacts on net operating working capital, which is, of course, one of the key objectives when an organization goes to finance their different components of the supply chain. Lastly, I'll just note that it's really important to be specific about the terms that you're using and the details, because factoring is, as I have described it here, it sometimes goes by different terms. And so what you'll really have to do is be very clear about what are the specific terms of the agreement. So key points here is that companies have two basic options to finance receivables. They can either take a loan against the receivable or they can sell it. And factoring is a very common approach to financing receivables. And when factoring, sellers use a third party basically to sell their receivable to in order to get cash. And there's two options, factoring with and without recourse. And those, of course, have some bearing on what the costs are and what the risks are. And finally, be very clear about the specific financing arrangements and terms. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please use the discussion forum. And I'll see you in the next segment. Thanks.